who is currently with us. And well, those two kind of inspired me in all sorts of different ways. I learned about WeDo, I learned about Little Bits, I learned about 3D printing through these guys. And they really inspired me to build my own makerspace at home and develop different types of projects with my kid, who's actually 11 years old today. When COVID hit in 2020, let's say restaurants were we're kind of dead. So I decided to take my passion in making, and I went back to school to further my education in maker culture. However, needless to say, a bachelor in maker culture doesn't really exist. I made a complaint and I met Ann-Louise through the complaint. And for the last year, I've been working closely with Ann-Louise and Nathalie in trying to move forward the maker culture in our Quebec schools. And I'm really, really happy to be here today. And I'm really happy to have my two mentors, Thomas and Mark, with me today. Thank you.
Okay, folks, we are recording. Take it away.
No worries. Let's share our screen.
Perfect.
Let's go.
Thank you. I'll just take the moment while you're showing the screen to give Ann-Louise a chance. As I said, she's our supervisor and she's here with us today. So if anybody does have any questions, feel free to ask her. But she's graciously given us the opportunity, Genevieve and myself, to practice our presentation skills. So she's letting us take the stage today, but she's definitely with us and available for questions if anybody has any. So she's a professor in education at Concordia University. She's the research chair in maker culture, so right on the mark. And she's also the director of the Innovation Lab at Concordia, which is a new and exciting endeavor that is taking off at rocket speed. So we're looking forward to seeing where that goes in the coming years. So, okay, Genevieve, thank you. I just wanted to take that moment and we will get going. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us here today. We wanted to do this presentation because, after speaking to teachers, elementary, we'll jump these slides just because we've already introduced ourselves. But, when COVID hit, we spoke to a lot of teachers and a lot of teachers were telling us that they had pretty much stopped all of their making activities for their students because they were teaching remotely and they couldn't access their maker spaces. And we sort of realized that there seems to be this idea now that making can't really happen unless it's involving fancy digital technology. And we thought, well, no, I mean, while it's great to have that digital technology, it's not absolutely necessary. And students can still learn from making with very basic materials. And so we thought, well, let's, when we saw this opportunity to present, we thought, let's have a discussion about low-tech making and the types of things that kids can learn through making with, when we say low tech, recycled materials, things that are easily found at home. And in some small cases like LEDs, just a very, very cheap option like LEDs that will cost a few cents per student. Students at home if teaching remotely. And also for schools that don't necessarily have the budget for a makerspace or a Fab Lab. To demonstrate through some examples today that it's still possible to make and for students to learn some important concepts and skills through low-tech making. And finally, two other things we wanted to validate as well, what teachers have been doing for a long time. There's a lot of criticism of making in the maker world, the maker movement, that people have been making for a very long time since human beings made the first tools. And this is very true. And I think the current movement is just a kind of a certain spirit of making that's resurging and using digital fabrication technologies that are now available to the average person. But we don't want to forget that teachers have been doing this and people have been making for a very long time with basic materials. And just because it doesn't use the digital fabrication tools doesn't mean there aren't benefits for student learning and for those who engage in that type of making. So in today's session, what we would like to do is we would like to talk about the types of projects that we can do with low tech, so very basic materials, and the connections we can make with the curriculum. And let's give you some ideas of the types of projects that we can do. Now, there are a few things we want to keep in mind when we're making in the classroom. The design of the maker experience is to a great extent more important than the tools that you're actually using. when we make with students, we want to design the experience so that they are problem solving and they are coming up with a solution themselves, and they're not just following some recipe. While following a recipe activity, you know, where everybody's doing step 1 together and then step 2 together and everybody has the same outcome, sure, they can definitely learn some skills and some manual skills and some things from it. They're not going to learn nearly as much as if you have an open-ended problem where you set them a challenge and they have to come up with a solution themselves. The other aspect of making is that we want to really offer experiences that offer a variety of interests that students can pick from, and also allows for a variety of skills coming in. We know that our students come to the classroom with varying levels of skills and experiences in the past, so we want to make sure that our activities can cater to that. So as Resnick said in his Lifelong Kindergarten book, we want to have a low floor so that novices can come in and still have a good experience and still be able to learn something and make something. We want to have a high ceiling so that there's room for improvement, and so that students or participants coming in who have more experience can still participate as well. And we want to have wide walls so that it can cater to a variety of experiences, interests rather, so that, you know, if somebody's more aesthetically interested, they can still participate, or somebody's interested in coding, they can still participate. So a variety of interests can be involved in the project. We also want to focus on the process rather than the final product. Typically in schools, we focus on the final product of a work and what we grade. The risk of doing this when it comes to making is that going to reduce the likelihood that students are going to take creative risks. They're going to likely then, afraid of if their final, just going to stick with what's safe, and they're not likely to learn as much if they take that approach. So as much as possible, for instance, evaluation, which we saw is one of the topics that people are interested in later on, we want to evaluate the process rather than the final product. So for instance, we can evaluate students' journals. We can evaluate students' reflections on their experience. We can evaluate, you know, if they came across a problem, their discussion of what was the problem and what did they learn from it and how do they progress from there, rather than evaluating the final product, so that we can give them that freedom to try something new, potentially fail, and then learn something from that failure. And it's the learning that counts, not the failure. And then finally, as I mentioned briefly, aesthetics. Aesthetics are very important, especially for girls and some boys who are not necessarily interested in the robotics and the coding. We want to make sure that those aesthetics are in there to cater to those interests as well, particularly as we all know that girls' participation in the STEM subjects is lower to begin with. So as much as we can encourage it, the better. And finally, we want to start early. I'll take an example of fractions. Typically, we only start formally teaching fractions, let's say in middle elementary school, but it doesn't mean that we don't want to be introducing these topics and these concepts earlier. We can start working on fractions as early as kindergarten through equal sharing problems. So, you know, the typical, we have two chocolate bars and 3 people want to share the chocolate bars. Well, how much chocolate can each person have? And this we can do without the symbols yet in kindergarten. And it's the same with making. We want to introduce these concepts as early as possible: problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, design, as early as possible, so that by the time they start in high school, which is when most maker programs start more formally, they've started to develop these concepts, and these programs can be much more effective than if they start to see these things the first time in high school. So we really want to start early. Now, how can we do that? We wanted to give you some ideas today, again, with low tech specifically, on how we might do that. And one group of activities that we can start with is making things move. Kids love to make things move. And we can do that with very, very cheap materials. So if we go to the next slide, all of the projects that I'm going to show you today involve very, very cheap materials. Recycled things like cardboard and pie tins, straws, and wooden dowels and tape and some glue. If your kids are too young to be using a hot glue gun or they don't have it at home, they can definitely use the tape or white glue. And maybe some balloons and elastic bands. So very, very cheap materials, easily available. Most people have them at home. Next slide, please. So what kind of challenge can we give them? Well, we can challenge them to create a car that moves on its own, for instance, for at least 10 feet, using the materials provided. All right, so that's the type of challenge we can give them. It's open-ended. There is, however, a certain direction they need to go in, so they have to make a car. But how they choose to solve it is totally up to them. So if we look at the next slide, we can see a couple of examples of how they might do this. They might create a balloon car. So they're using the balloon to propel the car. Very, very simple. It's just made with cardboard, a balloon, straws, dowels, and some bottle caps, or in this case, they use some coffee cup lids. They might choose an option where they're using an elastic band that's wound up. And they can then release it and the car can move on its own. In this case, there are some CDs involved, but again, they can use bottle caps or anything round that they have at home to create the wheels. So what are they actually learning during the activity? Well, some of the concepts that they're going to be learning may be things, as I mentioned before, that you're not covering yet in the elementary school classroom in the curriculum. So for instance, air pressure from the balloons, friction. If they're trying to do this on a tile floor, they might realize very quickly that the car's wheels just spin and that the car doesn't actually go anywhere. So they're going to have to figure out that they might need to put some elastic bands around the wheels to give them some friction. They're implicitly learning about kinetic and potential energy. So when that balloon is blown up, it's potential energy that's going to be changed into kinetic energy the moment they release the balloon. And they're learning about types of joints. They have to realize that the car wheel, in order for it to move independently, it can't be directly connected to the chassis of the car. There has to be some kind of intermediary joint. So all of these are concepts that you're probably not going to find in your curriculum, but they will talk about them more formally later on. So your next question is probably, okay, but then as an elementary school teacher, how is that relevant to me? Well, that's where your creativity in designing the activity comes into play. So things that you can introduce to the activity to actually more explicitly incorporate concepts from the curriculum. So for instance, if they're creating a car that's traveling on its own, or even if they just push it, they can measure the distance. So for our younger grades, this is a great way for them to start using measurements. So learning to measure using inches or centimeters, depending on your system of measurement. Then you can have them convert the length from feet to yards or from centimeters to meters. You can measure speed. So ask them how quickly it's going and discuss with them, how do we measure speed? How do we know how quickly something is going? And then they can figure that out and you can work on it with them. You can discuss fractions. So for instance, you can see how far people's cars go and then ask them, well, what fraction of the width of the classroom was so-and-so's car able to go? And so they can actually discuss fractions in a real life context that makes sense to them. Of course, you can integrate ratios and proportions by changing the question slightly and asking, for instance, how many times further did Mishra's car go than Jamie's car? And you can even look at angles. So let's say the challenge was to design a car that travels in a straight line. Well, you can measure the angle of deviation that the cars took, because most of the time they're not able to create a car that goes exactly straight. So there are a lot of concepts that, that are in the elementary school curriculum that can be tied to these activities with some creativity. Now, your next question may be, okay, well, how do we adjust this to different grade levels? Well, with this car activity, for instance, for kindergartners, you could just say, make a car. It doesn't have to, the wheels don't have to turn independently. It doesn't have to be pushable, just make a car. And this activity is great because the kids need to start breaking down solids into the different shapes. Okay, so some kind of three-dimensional object into its individual solid shapes. And this will become important later on, for instance, when they're in mathematics, but also when they're starting to do 3D design in CAD programs. In grade 1 or 2, for instance, you can have them make a card that can be pushed. So the wheels have to be able to turn independently. And this is where you can do the activities before that we mentioned, for instance, measuring the distance and integrating fractions. And grades 3 to 4, now you can ask them to make a card that can travel in a straight line. This adds a certain dimension of a certain challenge. You know, they have to figure out the wheel size and alignment and that kind of thing. So it definitely adds a dimension of challenge. And then from grades 5 to 8, you can ask them to design the challenge that we just discussed earlier, where they have to create a card that can travel on its own, that it doesn't need to be pushed. So as you can see, the activity can definitely be adjusted for different ages depending on, and level experience, depending on their level experience. Next slide, please. Now, how do we push this further? Well, the next challenge can be, how can you make a little boat that travels on its own? Now, admittedly, this is going to need some materials that may be a little bit harder to find, or, you know, they might have to be purchased outside, for instance, the hollow metal tube. But it's an example of how you can extend this activity, let's say when they're getting a little older and they can use candles, for instance, safely. And in the next example, this is how you can even take it to high school. So here you're going to see a video of a Stirling engine that was made just using tin cans, a balloon, some wire, some metal metal wool. Sorry, the name is escaping me. And then just using a flame underneath to make the Stirling engine actually function. So this is obviously much further beyond than elementary, but it gives an example of how far we can take making things move with very basic materials. So I will let Jen give you another example.
So making Play-Doh. Now, Play-Doh is a big part of childhood's lives, right? But for me, there's a very big difference between, I don't know, opening up a plastic container, consuming and playing with the Play-Doh, or making it yourself. Making Play-Doh is way easier than people actually think. If you go online and you look at all the different types of recipes, I'll give you a hint, they all work. They will all make a form of Play-Doh. This particular recipe, or my video that I'm showing, the reason why a lot of the recipes actually ask you to cook the Play-Doh. However, kids can't get their hands dirty because it's hot, it's cooking and all that. So what I've done, I've modified this recipe. So you take 1 cup of hot water and you dissolve as much salt as you actually can in that hot water. Let it cool down. You put it in a bowl, you mix your acid, a little bit of oil, some food coloring, and then mix all that well. And then you put, of course, your cup of flour, and you mix, and that's it. At some point, you mix, you will need your dough. And within, as you can see, within 2 minutes, you've already got Play-Doh that both you can play with. It's actually easier to do this than actually hop in your car, drive, and go to the store, purchase the Play-Doh, and come back. So this is a way easier way of getting Play-Doh, and it's easy, it's 2 minutes. And for your information, if you're gluten-free or vegan or anything like that, the flour, you can actually change the flour and use gluten-free flour to be able to make your Play-Doh. You might need to add a bit of flour for the consistency of the dough, but if you don't have flour or you're gluten-free, you can actually use your gluten-free flour to make your Play-Doh. As you can see, it took me about 2 minutes to make. You knead it and boom, you're done. Yay, Play-Doh, so easy to make. I love this stuff. Now, what are we learning through making Play-Doh? Because we're actually just making Play-Doh. So, and Play-Doh is already an amazing sensory activity that facilitates exploration and naturally encourages children to develop spatial reasoning while they play, create, investigate, explore. It also promotes your basic math skills, your cooking abilities, your fine motor skills, and social skills, to name a few. And when you look at the math portion, it's a recipe. like all cooking recipes, you actually need to measure 1 cup, a spoon, a quarter. If you want to make Play-Doh for 5 kids at the same time, well, then you actually have to measure up that recipe. So you're actually using ratios. Making Play-Doh is really the basis of cooking for children, because if you're making Play-Doh, you can actually make bread. It's very easy. It's the same process. All you're doing is putting a lot less salt and just adding yeast. And honestly, you've got bread. It's also giving them the fundamentals of baking, because the moment that you're kneading and working with flour and with your ingredients, you're basically already teaching a kid how to make a cookie on their own. So it's really giving you a basic in cooking, and cooking is very important for children to know. And sensory play. I could go on about sensory play and Play-Doh. The list of advantages are long, but in this particular case, we're looking at the social skills because we're actually following a recipe or listening to instructions, which will promote their social skills. Their fine motor skills, they're working with their hands. So they're always going in and kneading. So they're developing the skills to play. Creativity. I mean, I can go on and on of all the things that Play-Doh can promote within their creativity, exploration, their imagination, and that's just making the Play-Doh. Now, we can go beyond and give them the long list of activities that you can do with children in Play-Doh, it again is very long. But in this particular case, for kindergarteners, you give them Play-Doh and let them create whatever their imagination will let them create. Already, you are promoting creative self-expression. What about basic math skills and geometry? You can ask them to make different shapes. Would it be a 2D flat shape, or even a full geometric, a sphere, a cube, a rectangle? They're actually learning about their colors, because if you have blue and red, you mix them two together, you're making purple. So you're actually teaching them about the different color wheel. If you want to take it further in grade 1 or 2, when you're making Play-Doh, you can actually make a circuit with Play-Doh. I have more about that a bit later. You can actually promote different math activities for fractions. You got a ball of Play-Doh, divide it in 2, divide it in 4. You can actually weigh it and see the weight of the Play-Doh. What about lengths or measuring? You can ask them, make a snake 10, 20 centimeters long, so that they can actually see the length of their snake that they're making. If you're lucky to actually have a 3D printer, well, you can actually print really cool cookie cutters. Really fun. And to be honest, my 3D printing, I started with cookie cutters. I also have a really cool little bit maze activity that's done with little bits and Play-Doh, and it's at the end in our links. For grade 3 and 4, we've already made a car that moved. Now, why not making a maze and adding arrows so that the child can actually program the car to go through the maze, go up 2 steps, turn left 2 steps. For a little bit older, if you actually have a makey-makey or even a little bit makey-makey, you can actually build a game controller, and the Play-Doh is actually controlling the up, down, or the WASD keys of a game. So you can actually have fun with Play-Doh in video games. Making a circuit. Well, you can actually make a circuit with Play-Doh. Give me a second. Well, a lot of people don't realize is that Play-Doh is actually naturally conductive. It's made with salt, with a heap load of salt. So the moment that you have salt in Play-Doh, it is naturally conductive. Now the acid as well is conductive, because the charged particles can go through all the acid. And in this recipe, if you don't have cream of tartar, doesn't matter. Use lemon, use lime, whatever you have at home that's an acid base, you're good to go. And if you want to make insulating Play-Doh, actually it's the same recipe. All you're doing is you're replacing the salt content and you're replacing it with sugar. And there you go, you actually have insulating Play-Doh. Because if you notice, if you have two of your Play-Dohs that are touching together, your LED will not work. So it's best to have an insulating Play-Doh that will go in between. So yeah, and a lot of people don't know that when you're going online researching maker kits, give me a second, there we go. When you're going online looking at maker kits for squishy circuits, don't be fooled, these kits are $50. They're ridiculously expensive. Making Play-Doh, you can make it for under maybe $4 or $5 if you have all the ingredients. A battery pack is $1 on Amazon, and a pack of 100 LEDs is $6.99. So under $10, you have a squishy circuit maker kit for under $10. There's no need to spend the $40, $50 for these kits that you find online. Nathalie?
All right. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is paper circuits. Circuits is one of the basic skills and understandings that kids are going to need for anything with electronics later on in their maker experience. And one way to get them started on circuits in a really fascinating and fun way is with paper circuits. Can we go to the next slide? Great. So what you actually need to create paper circuits is very basic. You just need something like aluminum foil, a conductor, paper so that it can look creative and you can make different designs, a button battery, and some LEDs. And you can make just pretty much any kind of circuit. So what might we do? So we might, for instance, challenge kids to make a circuit using the materials provided. Okay, and then make a design, a creative design. One of the big reasons why I wanted to include the paper circuits in this presentation was because of the variety of things that you could do with it that incorporates the aesthetic aspect. As I mentioned before, aesthetics is really important, so I wanted to be able to give you this example. So what is a paper circuit? Well, essentially, it's a circuit that you make on paper. You're using the aluminum foil as your conductor. You have your battery as your power source, and you have an LED. And you're just taping it to the paper. Very easy to do. If we go to the next slide, you can see that you can do different types of circuits. You can do your standard circuit with just one LED. You can do a parallel circuit. You can do a series circuit. And you can even incorporate a photosensor in the circuit so that it responds to light. So very, very, very easy to do. Now, you can actually create designs with the circuits, and this is what's wonderful about it. It incorporates the aesthetics, the artistic side into the circuits, and all of these could have the same circuit, but the expression is different. The artistic side of it, the creativity side of it is different behind each one of these. Now, all of these ideas came from a website, and we're going to share this presentation with the participants. So in the YouTube, we're going to ask the organizers to include the link in the description. So you'll be able to click on the website and actually go and visit these websites to see these ideas. Next slide, please. I just wanted to point out, like Genevieve just mentioned with the Play-Doh making, is that a lot of websites are obviously going to try and promote certain products. For instance, adhesive LEDs that you can actually purchase, as well as copper tape, which you can also purchase. And they're expensive and they're not necessary. I can understand, sometimes if you have the budget and you have a class of 30 kids, it might be easier to use copper tape because it is self-adhesive and you don't have to worry about the glue getting all over the place, but it is not necessary. And what I like about the aluminum foil is it shows the kids that they have these materials at home that they can use to make this kind of thing. And it also allows them to start experimenting. Well, if I don't have aluminum foil, what else can I use that's conductive to create a paper circuit? All right, next slide, please. The other thing I wanted to point out is it's a paper circuit, so it's not going to be perfect. And so just embrace the imperfection. So for instance, we noticed that some of our paper circuits, because we're using aluminum foil and the connection isn't always great, it creates kind of like a fluttering effect. So one thing you can do is you can make that little fly thing, bugs in a jar that are fluttering. You can make an image with a fire or a flame where it's kind of sputtering in and out. Embrace those imperfections because they can make really, really neat projects. All right. So How can we take this further? Well, if you understand a circuit on paper, you can also create a circuit on fabric. All you need to do is replace the aluminum foil with some conductive thread that you will have to purchase. You can use some felt. You can use standard LEDs by just curling the end pins, which can get a little challenging. So you can purchase relatively cheaply LEDs that are actually intended for sewing on fabrics. And then you can also, just to make it easier to connect the battery to the circuit, we do suggest actually using a little battery connector there that you can see that you can turn on and off, because it is actually easier to sew with. But with some creativity, you can still create it without that battery holder. And so you can create pretty simple circuits like you see in this little example here. And you can create more complex circuits, as you can see here. And you can actually push this a little further. In this example, you can see we are using a microcontroller and we are using a light sensor, so that when there's light shone, it's meant to be a little night light, so that when the light turns on in the room, the little LEDs turn off, and when the light turns off in the room, the little LEDs turn on. So you can really bring this further with the kids as they're getting older or more experienced, and if you have the budget to incorporate some microcontrollers and still create that, keep that aesthetic creativity aspect to it. And here are just some websites again that you'll be able to have access when you can access this presentation to go and see some more examples for you. Your turn. We have about 5 minutes, Genevieve. So
yeah, I kind of noticed.
Yeah.
No worries. Okay,
Yeah.
so cardboard. I think during COVID, with all our Amazon shopping, we've got cardboard boxes galore. Now, this activity is actually promoting English language art by creating a cardboard theater box. Kids, we want to promote reading comprehension in children. So let's grab a book, let's read a book, and let's get the materials that we have at home, which is we have cardboard, we have paper rolls, we have paper, we have all of these materials, the tape, scissors, all of these materials we can find at home. So by using our materials that we do have at home, we can help children express what they have read in a book in a creative way by creating a really cool theater box. And as well, because we've already talked about Play-Doh circuits or even paper circuits, why not add a circuit to the box? Because then we're actually taking that box a little bit further. Now, what are we learning by making a theater box? Well, reading, comprehension, and storytelling and creative play is really, really crucial in the formative years. Making a theater box really blends this learning together. When we play with cardboard boxes, children are engaging in concentration, in spatial awareness, shape recognition, creative thinking, and simply playing with cardboard boxes may also introduce kids to early numeracy skills like height, comparison, and size. Give you guys a little fun fact. The actual cardboard box was actually inducted in the Toy Hall of Fame as the first imaginary toy in 2006. So if you want to go check, you can actually go check the Toy Hall of Fame for the cardboard box. I thought it was a really cool fun fact. When you're making a theater box, you're actually promoting fine motor skills because they need to cut with scissors or with a cardboard knife. You're actually promoting your math skills because, again, they need to measure and to know where exactly to cut. They're learning about the volumes of a box. English language arts is so important in those formative years, and it's promoting reading, storytelling, reading comprehensions. We're actually promoting the arts as well because they need to, let's say, they draw a backdrop, they can draw their own characters or just print their characters. And again, are we promoting creativity? Yes, we are. We're promoting the exploration and the imagination because even though they might not use a book, they can create their own storytelling and make their own theater box in relationship to their own stories. Taking this further. We can take this actually a lot further than we think. If you have access to a 3D printer, we're making a theater. Why not print out the props? Print out a couch, a table. You can actually print or even design the characters in Tinkercad and 3D print them. We're making an LED circuit, which we've already covered. What about motors? If you're adding a curtain, why not motorize that curtain to go open and close? If you're doing a backdrop, you can actually do a backdrop with paper using paper rolls and get them to basically move that backdrop. Why not add a motor? You can add an Arduino motor. You can actually add, why not a Lego motor? And as for Arduino, taking it further again, why not create an MP3 player and speakers so that the child can actually record their voice or record music as a backdrop to the theater that they're presenting. Now online, I found this really cool guy. And if you want to take cardboard to the next level, please go visit this guy. He is an Asian dad that I discovered a few months ago, and he has made like gazillion and gazillion of toys for his daughter, and they are mind-blowing. This is cardboard making to the next level. And here are our did I go too quickly?
I think we missed one.
My
conclusion.
apologies, we did miss one. And oops, sorry about that. Let me go back. Okay, go.
That's all right. So just as we've hopefully demonstrated in this presentation, students can definitely learn by using low tech and by making with very simple materials. If the project is well designed, we can definitely make connections with the curriculum with some creativity, including things that people typically think are harder to connect, for instance, language arts. Then we can begin to learn concepts even before they're formally introduced in the curriculum. I see that they're kind of trying to entice us out of the rooms already. It can definitely be low cost, and not having a makerspace shouldn't be a reason not to be able to make with youth, with students. So we would love for you to contact us if you have further questions. Feel free to contact us by email. Ann-Louise Davidson created the group educationmakers.ca, so a lot of information about us is available there. I would love to speak to teachers personally as well. And for my research, my dissertation, I'm looking at talking with teachers who are using making in the classroom